When you hear that term, world order, what immediately comes to mind for you? Is it some kind of grand, meticulously designed global plan, like a neat blueprint for how nations get along? Or maybe, I don't know, a messy, constantly shifting compromise, sort of a controlled chaos, maybe something else entirely? Today, we're diving deep into exactly that question. Humanity's, relentless quest to bring some kind of order to the chaos. We want to reveal how different civilizations have tackled that fundamental challenge and, importantly, what happens when those answers collide. Henry Kissinger's 2014 book, World Order, it's a key one for this. Our mission really is to uncover the foundational ideas that have shaped global interactions. We need to understand how they've clashed, how they've adapted over centuries, and see what timeless lessons they might hold for our incredibly complex world today. Because this isn't just a history lesson, right? It's about understanding the underlying forces shaping today's headlines and what it truly means to be well-informed about the global stage you live on. So, okay, let's unpack this. Starting with Europe. It's kind of fascinating how Europe, unlike, many other big civilizations, found its path to order, not through a single dominant empire, but through this unique kind of enduring form of pluralism.
That's absolutely right, yeah. If you look at the history of most major civilizations, order was usually established internally, through an empire. Peace was basically synonymous with the reach of imperial power. Think of China with its emperor, or Islam with the caliph. Political contests were often fought for control of an already existing framework. But Europe, after Rome fell, pluralism became the defining thing. No single ruler, no single entity held absolute sway. And that really set it on a completely different historical path.
And it was Europe's own, frankly, brutal efforts to end its internal conflicts. Things like the 30 Years' War that sort of inadvertently led to this new system, a system where a balance of power started to be seen as, natural and desirable. That's a huge mental shift, isn't it?
Oh, massive. The Protestant Reformation, for instance, completely shattered the idea of a universal church, which in turn fragmented Europe even further. It blurred the lines between political fights and religious ones. And this era saw figures like Cardinal Richelieu come to the fore. He was really instrumental as a statesman, shifting the focus away from these grand universal moral or religious claims towards state interests. That became the operating concept for foreign policy, raison d'etat.
And isn't that just fascinating? A decision made centuries ago, right in the middle of religious wars, basically paves the way for modern realpolitik. It just shows how deep these historical roots run, influencing how nations deal with each other today, even when those original religious drivers have faded.
Absolutely. Which brings us right to that seminal event, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. It fundamentally set up a multi-state order. States basically accepted the existence of other states, accepted their distinct religious paths as realities, and crucially, they agreed more or less to stop trying to challenge each other's fundamental right to exist.
Right. And from that peace, two sort of distinct balances of power emerged in Europe, correct?
Precisely, yeah. First, there was this overall balance. England often played the role of a guardian of general stability. They saw their national interest as tied up in keeping that equilibrium across Europe. And second, there was a Central European balance. This was largely manipulated by France, specifically to prevent a unified Germany from emerging. They worried it could become the most powerful country on the continent. Now, this system, it certainly didn't stop wars, let's be clear, but it did limit their impact because the goal was usually equilibrium, right? Not total conquest. It was about managing ambition, not trying to stamp it out entirely.
So this Westphalian system, born out of European conflict, eventually spreads its influence. It's interesting to think about how these principles, or maybe the deviations from them, showed up in America's own approach to global order later on. But before we jump across the Atlantic, this European system, even though it was groundbreaking, it was constantly being challenged. You had rulers seeking hegemony, like Louis XIV of France. But he was ultimately, as the source says, defeated by a Europe that sought its order in diversity. And then someone like Frederick II of Prussia, he went to war not necessarily for hegemony, but to transform Prussia's latent weakness into great power status. A different motivation, but still challenging the balance.
And then, bang, the French Revolution, its impact was just profound. It shattered that order all over again. You had figures like Jean-Jacques Rousseau introducing this universal claim of legitimacy, this idea that the revolutionary principles should expand to all humanity. Napoleon, of course, took that ambition to imperial heights, aiming for a global empire. Though vast, his reach was ultimately defeated by a coalition of European states. In many ways, it was a kind of belated vindication of Westphalian principles. The old powers, despite their own rivalries, banded together to stop one dominant force from taking over everything.
Okay, so after Napoleon, Europe has to pick up the pieces, rebuild its order. That leads us to the Congress of Vienna in 1815. And there's a fascinating detail about that time. Diplomacy then was just fundamentally different from how we see it today. Diplomats at Vienna, they had huge autonomy. They weren't getting minute-by-minute instructions from their capitals like modern diplomats do. It sounds like, I don't know, a dream for negotiators today, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. A different world. And the Congress of Vienna really showcased two pivotal statesmen with vastly different ideas about order. On one side, you had Metternich of Austria. He championed stability through legitimacy. He famously believed invention is the enemy of history. He saw Austria's national interest as basically a metaphor for Europe's overall interest. His goal was essentially to freeze the existing order, keep things stable. And on the other hand, Otto von Bismarck of Prussia. Through, well, a few daring strokes, he created a united Germany. But in doing that, he arguably made a flexible balance of power perhaps impossible. It led to this institutionalized permanence in alliances. Diplomacy suddenly became a matter of life and death. And that rigidity was definitely a significant factor in the miscalculations leading up to World War I.
Wow. So Bismarck's genius in uniting Germany, it kind of inadvertently made the world much more dangerous by locking these alliances in place.
That's almost an ironic twist, isn't it? His very success redefined the stakes, making diplomacy feel like this zero-sum game, which is precisely what Metternich had been trying so hard to prevent. That tension, between unification and stability just keeps popping up.
It really does. So fast forward past two devastating world wars. Those traditional Westphalian principles in Europe, they were greatly diminished. We then entered the bipolar order of the Cold War with Europe as a central ideological and military battleground. But its third major contest over Europe, the Cold War itself, thankfully ended peacefully. This led to Germany's reunification, which was huge, and the reemergence of Eastern European nations. They regained their independence, their own distinct identities, and that brings us more or less to today. With the European Union, it certainly diminishes member states' sovereignty in some ways, pulls some traditional government functions to Brussels. But European politics, it remains primarily national. Its soft power approach, influence through culture, economics, cooperation, not just military, it's genuinely inspiring. A real testament to choosing peace over power politics. However, as Kissinger notes, few of the other regions have shown such overriding dedication to this single style of policy. And that creates a potential imbalance globally. It seems like Europe finds itself, quote, suspended between a past it seeks to overcome and a future it has not yet defined. It's still very much an ongoing experiment.
Okay, so we've traced Europe's unique path from chaos to this pluralistic balance of power, and now into the EU experiment. But I wonder, did other major civilizations think about world order in fundamentally different ways? What did order even look like in, say, the Islamic world?
That's a great question because, it offers a really profound contrast. Islam introduced a universal concept of order. The idea was a single divinely sanctioned government destined to unite and bring peace to the whole world. He would expand over what was termed the realm of war, the Dar al-Harb, until it encompassed everything. The Ottoman Empire, for instance, revived this claim to a single legitimate global governance. But, and this is crucial, there was often a pragmatic twist. Geopolitical needs sometimes overrode ideology. You saw things like Ottoman-French naval cooperation against Spain, or even alliances between the Habsburgs and the Safavid Empire in Persia against the Ottomans. Realpolitik often trumped the universal vision in practice. It shows that even these grand universal systems have to deal with, earthly realities.
And you can still feel that historical tension today, can't you? Especially in the Middle East, a region that seems, as the text puts it, quote, destined to experiment with all of its historical experiences simultaneously before it finds any kind of settled international order. It's like watching a living history lesson play out, sometimes quite painfully.
Absolutely. And within that complex picture, we've seen Islamism emerge as a powerful revolutionary tide, seeking to dismantle the existing regional order, the state system. You have figures like Hassan al-Banna, who sought freedom from what he saw as man-made doctrines, and then Sayyid Qutb, who envisioned a much more radical overthrow of all existing systems to be replaced by a literal global implementation of the Quran. This represents really an almost total inversion of Westphalian world order. Because in this view, the state itself isn't the fundamental unit. It's just a weapon of convenience in a much broader religious struggle. It's a clash of basic assumptions about how the world should work.
A really clear example of that clash is the Arab-Israeli conflict, right? Anwar Sadat's peace initiative with Israel that was grounded squarely in Westphalian principles. Sovereign states, national interests, defined borders. But that stands in such sharp contrast to Islamist views that fundamentally deny Israel's legitimacy, viewing its very existence as outside any acceptable framework.
Exactly. And look at Iran. Its supreme leader, Khamenei, explicitly declared that universal religious principles, not national interests, would dominate the coming world order. This definitely reflects Persia's long history as an ancient empire, a civilization with its own strong sense of identity and mission. However, Khomeini viewed the 20th century map of the Middle East, the one drawn largely by colonial powers, as a false and un-Islamic creation. And significantly, within this kind of divinely ordained framework, dissent isn't just political opposition, it's treated as blasphemy. That makes integration into a Westphalian system, which relies on negotiation between states with differing views, very challenging.
And then you have Saudi Arabia, which seems genuinely torn. On one hand, it relies heavily on Westphalian concepts, state sovereignty, alliances for its security and international standing. But on the other, it propagates Wahhabism, described as perhaps the most fundamentalist version of the faith, which often seems at odds with modernity and pluralism. It looks like a really complex, sometimes contradictory balancing act for them on the world stage.
For sure. And the outcome of the Arab Spring really highlighted this struggle too. Those initial calls for more open political life or democracy, they were largely overwhelmed by a violent contest. A contest between basically military-backed authoritarianism on one side and Islamist ideology on the other. And this raises a critical question for any society going through upheaval. How do you define the people, and what actually replaces the old authorities when they fall? The answers to those conflicts profoundly shape whatever future order emerges, or fails to emerge.
Okay, let's shift focus again. If we turn our attention to Asia, it's interesting. Kissinger observes that far more than in Europe, the maxims of the Westphalian model find their contemporary expression in some ways, but also there are profoundly different traditions at play too.
Definitely. China's historical concept of all under heaven, or Tianxia, that's a prime example of a non-Westphalian order. China saw itself as the undisputed center of civilization, the source of all legitimate order. It expected other peoples to acknowledge this. It believed its influence expanded not really by conquest, but by a kind of cultural osmosis, by others recognizing its superiority. So when Western powers tried to integrate China into the European Westphalian system, based on the equality of sovereign states, Chinese emperors initially rejected it. They famously believed we possess all things, and had nothing to learn or gain from these barbarians. China's reluctant adoption of Westphalian diplomacy, things like permanent embassies and foreign ministries, only came after painful military defeats in the 19th century. It shows how deeply rooted their own concept of order was.
And China's modern evolution is just as fascinating, isn't it? You had Mao making that huge strategic shift to engage the U.S. when the Soviet threat grew serious. And then Deng Xiaoping famously focusing on modernization, on building China's strength, aiming to extend influence without explicitly claiming global leadership, at least not yet. Hide your strength, bide your time. China's current view, though, seems to strongly emphasize that national sovereignty is far more important than human rights.
That's a clear point of friction with Western concepts. It's a really complex mix of ancient self-perception and very modern pragmatism.
It is. And what's absolutely crucial for the future, really, is the need for China and the United States to find ways to coordinate their policies, at least on major global issues. Concepts of partnership, maybe paradoxically, need to become elements of the modern balance of power, especially in Asia. This is needed to mitigate the purely adversarial aspects of the relationship. The stability of the region and maybe the world really hinges on finding that delicate balance. Speaking of adaptability, the story of Japan's transformation is just, wow, it's remarkable. From being this locked country, Sakoku, with strict rules against foreigners, what was it that allowed them to pivot so dramatically, so strategically, after Commodore Perry's black ships arrived in 1853?
Japan reacted with incredible speed and focus. They embraced a sweeping program of reform, the Meiji Restoration. The explicit goal was to achieve equality with the Western powers, to avoid China's fate of being carved up. They even formed alliances with European powers, like the Anglo-Japanese alliance, only to later work towards expelling those same powers from Asia during World War II. It was a masterclass in strategic adaptation. Post-war, Japan's new pacifism is often discussed, but Kissinger describes it more as an acquiescence in American predominance. And importantly, this posture, backed by the U.S. security guarantee, has actually served as a really important anchor of Asian stability and global peace for decades.
And then there's India, another giant with its own incredibly ancient strategic thought. We can look back at texts like Kautilya's Arthashastra. There, power was the dominant reality. States were seen almost like fish in water, the larger inevitably devouring the smaller. It advocated a strategy of circles, constantly assessing threats and opportunities from neighbors and neighbors' neighbors. It sounds incredibly pragmatic, almost, well, cynical.
It is deeply pragmatic, yes.
Yeah.
Rooted in a very clear-eyed understanding of power dynamics in a dangerous world. Later, the British, ruling India, unified it largely for their own security reasons. They effectively defined an Indian national interest for a geographic unit, even before a unified Indian nation fully existed in the modern sense. Then, after independence, India, under Nehru, charted a unique course. He elevated freedom of maneuver from a bargaining tactic into an ethical principle. This was the policy of non-alignment, steering a path between the major Cold War blocs. Today, India, with its growing economy and influence, is widely seen as a potential fulcrum of 21st century order, positioned to play a really crucial role in the global balance.
So, as we kind of wrap up this tour of Asia, it's worth noting, isn't it, that two distinct balances of power seem to be emerging. One in South Asia, centered around India and Pakistan, and another in East Asia, involving China, Japan, the Koreas, and the US. But neither region seems to possess that consistent single balancer state like Europe historically had with Britain. That absence of a clear anchor, it just adds another layer of complexity, maybe instability to the future in Asia, don't you think?
Absolutely. The dynamics are much more fluid, arguably more unpredictable.
Okay, so after this whole sweep through Europe, the Islamic world, and Asia with all their different ideas, what does this all mean for America, for its own very distinct approach to world order?
Well, America's founding was unique in this context. It saw itself differently, as a city upon a hill, right? A place where humanity's true purpose would be revealed. An example. So initially, its foreign policy was focused mainly on building domestic strength, consolidating the continent, and keeping foreign entanglements at bay. That was the core idea behind the Monroe Doctrine. Perfect ourselves here, then maybe the world will follow our lead.
But that changed pretty significantly with Theodore Roosevelt, didn't it? He seemed to recognize that the international system wasn't static. It was in constant flux, driven by ambition, by self-interest, power politics. He believed international law, well, it needed force behind it to actually work, that disarmament was just an illusion. So he advocated for the U.S. to act proactively, globally, to defend its own interests. That was a clear shift from isolation towards active engagement, based on a pretty hard-nosed view of power.
Yeah, and that approach stood in really stark contrast to Woodrow Wilson's idealism just a bit later. Wilson genuinely believed that autocracies, non-democratic states, were the root cause of conflict. He thought a new concept of international peace could be built, based on a universal moral principle, collective security, the idea that all states would band together to oppose any aggressor. The tragedy of Wilsonianism, though, as Kissinger puts it, was that it gave America this elevated foreign policy doctrine, this idealistic mission, but it was kind of unmoored from a sense of history or geopolitics, divorced from the realities of how power actually worked.
That's a really powerful statement. So are you saying Wilson's idealism, even with its noble goals, might have actually made American foreign policy less effective sometimes by sort of divorcing it from the messy realities of power politics? And how has that unmooring, that tension between idealism and realism continued to play, right up to today?
It's definitely an ongoing tension. You see it again and again. Franklin D. Roosevelt, for instance, he was certainly influenced by Wilson. He sought a grand and global alliance, a new world of law. He explicitly rejected the traditional European balance of power. But then, boom, the realities of the Cold War hit hard. American containment strategy against the Soviet Union fundamentally viewed the USSR as an aberration, something outside the legitimate international community that needed to be contained, not balanced. Kennan, the architect of containment, actually proposed a more traditional balance of power approach through spheres of influence, but it was rejected. Deemed politically impossible in a democracy like America, Washington could accept a balance of power as a fact, maybe, but not really embrace it as a guiding policy. This fundamental discomfort with balance of power as a stated goal, even when practicing it, continues to shape U.S. foreign policy debates.
The Korean War really stands out as this incredibly complex three-cornered maneuver, as the book calls it, a struggle for dominance within the communist bloc, with North Korea's Kim Il-sung pushing hard for the invasion, getting reluctant backing from Stalin and Mao. What's fascinating there is China's intervention. Kissinger describes them fighting a kind of psychological war, using principles from Sun Tzu's Art of War, viewing negotiations not really as a way to find peace, but as an extension of the battlefield. It just highlights how deeply different cultural and strategic ways of thinking clashed head-on.
Then, of course, came the Vietnam War, a conflict where America lost its first war and also the thread to its concept of world order. Those containment principles, the domino theory, which seemed successful or at least applicable in Europe, they proved much less applicable in Asia.
Okay.
Especially in post-colonial societies with weak political institutions and complex nationalist movements. It was a really painful lesson about the limits of applying one region's framework universally.
Richard Nixon's approach marked another big shift, didn't it? A return to pragmatism. He strongly emphasized national interest. He sought to, in his words, temper our instinct that we knew what was best for others. And that thinking led directly to the dramatic opening to China, creating a new triangular balance of power strategy involving the US, USSR, and China. It was a stark return to realpolitik, acknowledging a multipolar reality.
Right, and then the Reagan administration followed, bringing back a strong ideological component. They held the deep belief that the conflict with the Soviet Union wasn't just a power struggle, but a moral one, that it would ultimately end when the adversary realized the superiority of American principles. And in a way, the Soviet collapse seemed to vindicate that view, proving that the balance of forces, both material and ideological, had decisively turned against them.
This really brings us back to that core dilemma for America, doesn't it? Even today, its deeply felt aspirations for human betterment, its Wilsonian streak, often runs up against the realities of power, leading to this risk of oscillating between extremes, overextension, trying to remake the world, and then disillusioned withdrawal when things get tough. How does a nation strike that balance between its ideals and the practicalities of global power?
Well, Kissinger argues America's role involves an inherently unending quest for that very balance, a balance between the uniqueness of the American experience and the idealistic confidence in its universality. And crucially, he concludes, it's a balance that ultimately does not permit withdrawal. The world is just too interconnected now. America can't simply opt out, even if it sometimes wants to.
So, after exploring all these vast historical perspectives, Europe, Islam, Asia, America, what does this all mean for the world we live in right now and the world that's coming? We're grappling with these profound challenges. The nuclear age, for one, where all-out war between major powers could impose costs out of proportion to any conceivable benefit. That reality fundamentally forces a rethink of international order itself. How do you manage conflict when the ultimate consequence is annihilation?
And then there's cyber technology. It adds this other, maybe even more complicated layer. It has completely outstripped strategy. We have these incredible capabilities, but without any real common understanding or agreed upon limits. And unlike nuclear deterrence, where the idea of mutually assured destruction created a grim sort of stability, symmetrical retaliation in cyber is often impossible, or might have wildly different impacts. How do you deter a cyber attack when you might not even be sure who launched it, or when retaliating could cause unpredictable cascading effects? The old models don't fit neatly.
You know, as we look to the future, it really strikes me that technology isn't just a tool within the existing order. It seems to be fundamentally reshaping our understanding of order itself. Like, how is the sheer volume of information, the constant stream, changing human choice? And even how we govern ourselves, this datafication of everything, the overwhelming prevalence of information, which isn't the same as knowledge or wisdom. And the way information gets customized and filtered for each of us, doesn't that threaten our traditional understanding of our shared reality of informed human choice?
It's a huge question. And, things like social networks and this relentless, sometimes performative pursuit of transparency, they can actually inhibit the development of leaders. Leaders with the fortitude to make decisions that, by definition, cannot be based on a consensus. Decisions that require judgment, foresight, maybe even unpopular choices. In this kind of environment, it can be really difficult for truly visionary figures to emerge. The lead time they might have needed, the space for reflection away from the instant spotlight, it might just be gone. Every potential decision gets picked apart in real time, every nuance often lost in the digital noise.
And the political implications are stark, aren't they? These technologies allow instant communication, yes, but they can also bring conflicting, occasionally incompatible value systems into ever closer contact, often amplifying the extremes, the partisan divides, and Western leaders may be feeling pressure to react instantly by immediately endorsing digital movements or protests elsewhere. They can end up prioritizing a kind of mood of the moment over deeper underlying strategic factors. It feels almost like politics by trending hashtags sometimes.
Which leads to a really crucial point made in the book. Order should not have priority over freedom, but the affirmation of freedom should be elevated from a mood to a strategy. Great statesmen, historically, they almost invariably had this instinctive feeling for the history of their societies. They understood the deep currents, the long-term trends, not just the surface ripples.
So that just begs the question, doesn't it? What will be the attitudes, the capabilities of those who aspire to be great statesmen in this internet age? When that historical instinct might be replaced by data analytics and long-term strategy potentially crowded out by the demand for instant public reaction. That's a sobering thought. We've covered such a vast sweep of history today. From Europe's exhaustion after the 30 Years' War leading, almost accidentally, to the Westphalian system, this value-neutral procedural scaffolding that somehow became the global norm, to the incredibly diverse approaches of Islamic and Asian civilizations, each with its own deep-rooted concepts of order. And finally, looking at America's unique, powerful, and often ambivalent role on the world stage. It's truly a testament to how complex these historical forces are, isn't it? How one leader's solution, like Bismarck's unification of Germany, often ends up creating the next generation's biggest challenge.
That's right. And the global order we have today really is composed of an amalgam of American idealism, that Wilsonian impulse, mixed with these traditional, often unspoken concepts of balance of power. It's a precarious, sometimes contradictory, yet maybe essential combination for managing global affairs.
So after everything we've discussed, thinking about the nuclear threat, cyber disruption, the challenges to rational discourse, here's a final thought for you, our listener. Can humanity propel itself into a future without effective limits or order, just careening from crisis to crisis without really comprehending the forces at play? Or can the diverse historical experiences, the different concepts of order we've explored today, Westphalian, Tianxia, Islamic universalism, American exceptionalism, somehow find a way to coexist? Can they be woven together to shape a more stable, maybe more sustainable future? That's a question that really demands our attention and perhaps our collective ingenuity going forward.
And ultimately, Kissinger concludes, a purposeful American role, engaged and thoughtful, will be philosophically and geopolitically imperative for navigating the challenges ahead. Yet, and this is key, world order cannot be achieved by any one country acting alone. It has to be cultivated patiently, persistently, not imposed. It requires a shared vision, however difficult that is to achieve, a deep understanding of history, warts and all, and maybe most importantly, the courage to adapt to realities we might not like but cannot ignore.